What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Hey guys, what's up? This is Falsebooles123 and welcome back to my channel. This is Read the Controversy, a series on my channel where we read infamous, polarizing, or otherwise challenged work and explore the controversy and zeitgeist around it. Today's episode is about drag queen Courtney Act, the Australian government, and the vile propaganda spread by the gay agenda, meant to recruit your children to an unholy queer crusade against normality. How are these fifth columnists doing it? By reading a picture book about a little girl wearing pants to her birthday party. Wait, what?
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
So as always, let us list out the key players, namely Courtney Act, Senator Alex Antic, and the iconic Australian children's show, Playroom Storytime. Courtney Act is a gender-fluid Australian drag queen who's known for her singing career and staple in reality television, including such feats as being a runner-up in Season 1 of Australian Idol, and being a runner-up in Season 6 of RuPaul's Drag Race. It should also be mentioned that Courtney Act is a bit of a glassbreaker in the field. She's considered to be the first openly LGBTQ contestant on Australian Idol, and also was the second same-sex dance group in Dancing with the Stars. Suffice to say, in some small way, that she is an openly queer person who is changing the landscape of Australian television. Senator Alex Antic is an Australian senator for the Australian Liberal Party who's been in office since 2019. It's important to understand that in Australia, the Liberal Party is right-leaning, and given his other rhetoric, he would be classified as a hard-nosed Republican here in America. Playroom Storytime is exactly what it sounds like, a morning kids show where TV personalities read kids' book. It's like reading Rainbow. Courtney starred in Season 5, Episode 19 of the show, in which she read The Spectacular Suit by Kat Patrick. Now, at the time of writing, I have not been able to view the actual episode because I don't live in Australia, and this episode is not sponsored by Surefshark VPN. But, feel free to call me. Give me that sponsorship. Thank you. That being said, I was a good cookie and, actually read the book. It's actually kind of sweet. It's like a gender-bent Unako Komoyo, where this little girl wants to have this big blowout party, but she's afraid to ask her mom to allow her to wear a suit instead of a dress, and her family gets together, takes this drawing of the titular spectacular suit, and sews it for her. So she wakes up, her family all gets together, and it helps her express herself in a way that she felt comfortable with. And I guess it's probably good journalism to mention that while the book itself is kind of vague on its queer theming, it's a lot more explicit within the meta text. To quote the author from a promo on the book, "Throughout my life, I have fallen in love with a lot of different suits. Very few have ever fit me properly. As a kid, queerness manifested in a complicated way, wanting to be noticed and not wanting to be noticed all at the same time. Clothes, especially when you're required to wear the wrong ones, can be crucial. In conversation with other folks from the queer community, I realized I wasn't alone in this bit of childhood." So Patrick, when they wrote the book, was pulling from a universal queer experience of being gender expansive, and trying to find an expression that was uplifting. Now, as far as I can understand, the books chosen for Storytime are done by the aptly named Children's Book Council of Australia, but ACT, as you can imagine, would have a personal affinity with these types of storytelling.
Is that the more stories that we can have describing lots of different types of experiences, kids get to understand themselves relative to that. And for me, having more stories, even as an adult, helped me to understand my own gender identity, which ultimately wasn't trans, but when I was younger and I only had 2 options, I thought, oh, I don't really feel like a man, therefore I must be a woman. But when I had more examples, I was able to understand that I'm just me.
So to put it bluntly, this is a story about a gender-variant girl written by a queer writer and presented by yet another gender-non-conforming queer person. And Representative Alex Antic responded with some antics. In the November Senate estimates, it's like a budget thing, Antic accused ABC Managing Director David Anderson over grooming Australians' children while holding up a picture of Courtney Act in the act of reading a children's book.
Mr. Anderson, I've got a couple of questions about some programming matters. And at the moment, the ABC's airing a program called Courtney Act, The Spectacular Suit, in which a male drag performer, Shane Jenik, reads a children's book called The Spectacular Suit, this is it here, about a female child wanting to wear male clothing. The program was rated G, and it's been heavily promoted on TV and on the app. My question is this: why is the ABC grooming Australian children with this sort of adult content? I'm waiting for an answer.
Above. Girls wearing pants. I mean, that's the level of rubbish you're putting forward.
We are not grooming.
Don't hang around, Sarah.
Okay.
Amazing what triggers a response. The truth. The truth that the ABC's grooming our children.
We are not grooming.
And it needs to be called
hang
out.
around. Sarah, you're quite welcome to leave.
So, grooming is a really serious matter. It's not for being played with by conservative senators so that they can make headlines.
That's what grooming looks like.
This was met with pushback by Anderson, Green Party member Sarah Hanson-Young, and Courtney Act herself in a very well-written op-ed for the Sydney Morning Herald, which I recommend you read. From said op-ed: there's an increasing trend in the U.S. for some extreme Republicans to use the term grooming when referring to Democrats who support LGBTQ+ people's rights, demonizing their enemy by accusing them of doing the universally agreed upon most heinous of things: sexually abusing children. Grooming is a psychological process through which an abuser builds a relationship with a young victim so they can sexually abuse them. Grooming is not drag queen story time. When you use language of abuse where none exists, the words lose meaning, endangering young people. This tactic is also an anti-LGBTQ+ prejudice, breeding hate for queer people by conflating our identities with pedophilia, a long-used and baseless trope. I refer to my story time as grooming as a political tactic to weaponize the protection of children to win political points. It's stripped straight from the right-wing American culture war playbook. I normally wouldn't respond and give this fringe opinion more oxygen, but I've seen this tactic deployed increasingly in Australia, and it needed to be debunked. Now, I can't comment on the emerging conservative trends and rhetoric of Australian politics, nor do I have any interest to. That being said, Courtney has raised a really interesting idea, so I want to explore this dichometric meaning and also refute Alex Antic here, because he's kind of a little bitch, and I'm like a little cuck soy boy, so let's get into it.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
In entomology, there is something known as descriptive linguistics, which is the approach of defining a word based on the social group that uses it. This tends to be really useful for things like cons or pigeons or colloquial dialects, but it has its limitations, such as what happens when 2 different linguistic communities use the same word for different things. For example, think of the words rubber and pants and their respective meaning in both American and British English. Charming miscommunication happens because these 2 groups have very different meanings for the same word. This also happens a little closer to home within partisan culture. I will try my best to avoid being polemic, but terms such as woke and cancel culture tend to have wildly different meanings and usages, depending on what side of the political aisle you happen to stand. For instance, leftists tend to define wokeness in its original AAVE meaning, as a self-awareness of the systematic biases within society and the belief that those systems should be reformed or dismantled, and conservatives define wokeness as forced diversity, representation in media, minorities having opinions. I hate to be reductive, but a lot of political terms become very vague and spooky in the hands of conservative pundits. There's definitely a trend of leftist political theory vocab being adopted into conservative grievance buzzwords, but a topic for another time. But now that we have acknowledged the double meaning of the word, let's actually define it. What is grooming? Grooming is a process of emotionally and psychologically conditioning a child or someone else of limited mental capacity into performing sex acts. It's a multi-stage process, and for sake of clarity, I will be discussing it in detail. I don't want to do this either, but it's better for you to know than not know. Timestamp on screen. Darkness to Light, a child sexual abuse prevention organization, lists these following stages of grooming. 1. Targeting the child. 2. Gaining the child and caregiver's trust. 3. Filling a need. 4. Isolating the child. 5. Sexualizing the relationship. And 6. Maintaining control. I'm including a helpful chart, so pause the video, and yes, all of these resources are in the description. If you want a more personal account of these types of situations, Kat Black, who is an amazing content creator all around, made a very in-depth video discussing her own abuse and the way that her abuser groomed her. There's a link in the cards, but be forewarned, it's not an easy video to watch. For those that use the timestamp, the TLDR this is that grooming follows a similar pattern of other abusive relationships, where the abuser targets, isolates, and then uses various means of control, often guilt and shame, to intimidate their victims into keeping quiet about their abuse. So you can understand why Sarah found Antics comments highly offensive. Grooming is a dress-up term for CSA. Conservatives have been using the term grooming in a very specific way, essentially anything that is visibly queer. Take the example at hand. The phrase that gets repeated is a little girl wearing pants, which Antic constantly refers to as cross-dressing. He equated what is today seen as a very moderate amount of gender variance as this rip-roaring, opium-fueled, mauling dietrich and man-drag debacle. Now I want to be very clear that the use of the term is a queer sub-defense. It is on its surface using the term groomer as a stand-in for what people really want to say, that the gays are pedos and degenerates spreading the disease, infecting the nation. However, I do like to be nuanced and empathetic, and there is an ideology behind the more base fear-mongering. Let's talk for instance about Abigail Scheer. She wrote Irreversible Damage, and her main idea is that there is this mimetic contagion known as rapid onset dysphoria, which she concludes is being spread by the transgender propagandists to make the children think that being trans is super duper cool. Actually, ooh-woo. How do they do this? By existing and talking about their lives and being transgender. Why are they corrupting the children? Well, my theory is that it's all a devious plot to turn them into anarcho-communists and usher in the Age of Horus and start a new world order. MKUltra conspiracies aside, there's this idea in conservative circles that having queer visibility is tantamount to brainwashing, and so they use the term grooming to mean indoctrination. But instead of the shadowy cabal being the Illuminati using Masonic images and product monarch techniques to hypnotize your kids, it's queer people reading a children's book about it being okay to wear pants as a woman. But just remember, no matter what kind of subliminal indoctrination is happening to your children, it's probably Lady Gaga's fault. So now that I've laid out how these two groups understand the term, let's actually ask the question, was Courtney Act grooming the children?
Won't somebody please think of the children?
No! You dumb bitch. Oh my fucking god. Okay. Just because I love doing Socratic dialogue and then logically applying that schema to a situation, let me break it down to you. Definition 1. Did Courtney Act emotionally condition and sexually abuse a child by reading a children's book? Well, the answer is no. It's a book about a little girl's birthday party, not a copy of Hustlers. And also, as has been established, grooming is a multi-stage process and it takes longer than 6 minutes on national television. Definition 2. Did Courtney Act indoctrinate children by spreading the queer agenda? Well, I usually understand the canard of the queer agenda as any action that normalizes or tolerates queerness, so the question really hinges on what you consider queerness to be. Queerness is relative to heteronormativity, so what's considered subversive and what's considered normative changes over time. People thought that Katherine Hepburn and Marlene Dietrich were cross-dressers for wearing pants. My dad thought it was gay to use pink shampoo in the 2000s, and now we live in a world where teenage boys perm their hair and wear makeup. So yeah, gender roles and queerness is relative. So given that the ideas of queerness and gender roles and all of this are so vague and fiddly, we need to be more specific. Definition 3. Did Courtney Act encourage children to identify as a queer identity? No. This book is about exploring your gender expression, not about being bi-curious in college. And the ABC ad copy is very neutral on the supposed queerness of all this. The TV guide description called it a book about being yourself. And in the educational promotional material called Play School Storytime, Playworld Ideas for Educators, the Spectacular Suit.pdf, the pedagogical actions recommend involve creating a play space in which school children pretend to be fashion designers and go on pattern hunts and make their own spectacular suit, not, dye their hair and pick out neo-pronouns. Definition 4. Did Courtney Act and ABC try to normalize variant gender expression? Well, yep, you caught them. By reading a book about a little girl wearing a suit, they probably were okay with little girls wearing suits? I mean, imagine that. Bitchiness aside, gender expression is really complicated and very personal, and a lot of queer people have fought their entire lives to find a way of expressing themselves in a way that worked for them. And you might say to yourself, well, that's fine for the freaks and geeks out there, but I'm, normal? Okay. We'll make it personal. I grew up in the 2000s. I was a sissy, not even femme, and I just wasn't into sports and bro culture. I got bullied for just being myself and having interest. And it took me a really, really long time to unlearn a lot of these ideas about masculinity that were toxic to me and made me unhappy. And those ideas were pushed by a society that associated anything unmanly as queer and also morally bad. And even if you're the most butch or femme person out there, there's probably something you like that doesn't match your strict definition of gender.
I bake my own bread. Yes, I am outing myself as a baker, as someone who likes to cook. I'm not a woman. I am ultra masculine, as you can see.
What preaching this kind of gender variance does is destigmatize it. And I think by having neutral stories that aren't inherently about queer people, but queer experiences, in this sense being outside of traditional straight gender roles, is a way of allowing more freedom and happiness in the world, making sure that children, especially queer children, feel safe to exist. I want to play that clip of Courtney Act again.
Is that the more stories that we can have describing lots of different types of experiences, kids get to understand themselves relative to that. And for me, having more stories, even as an adult, helped me to understand my own gender identity, which ultimately wasn't trans, but when I was younger and I only had two options, I thought, oh, I don't really feel like a man, therefore I must be a woman. But when I had more examples, I was able to understand that I'm just me.
We've really got to go.
And sure, you can come back at me with, I don't think the Australian broadcast company should be promoting such libertine ideas as an individual right to the pursuit of happiness with my tax dollars. But if you do that, I think you kind of risk sounding like Antic over here, whose argument keeps getting reduced down to, I don't think women should wear pants. So in my mind, I don't think the accusation of grooming holds water. I mean, unless you think that queer people are inherently sexual perverts here to corrupt your children.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Campbell's recently released a new ad online that features a gay couple talking to their kids about Star Wars. Take a look.
Dun 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 dun. Cooper, I am your father. No, no, no. I am your father. Oh.
That's got to be the worst Vader ever.
Campbell's Star Wars soups.
How about you be Chewbacca?
Made for real life.
All right, so Campbell's is actually doing this ad campaign where they have real life families do the ads. And they want to represent the diversity of families in America. And they did so by having a same-sex couple, feeding their child soup. Yeah. Super sweet, it shouldn't be objectionable, except the religious right in the country had a problem with it. One of those individuals was a woman by the name of Jess Hicks, who went online, Facebook specifically, and said the following. I'm so sick of this homosexual agenda. You sell soup, not butt sex. Please take...
Upland, you own everything. Upland, you earn everything. Upland, you earn Upland, you own everything.
Don't you hate it when you're watching two men feed their children lunch and you just can't stop thinking about how they suck and fuck each other like the little perverts they are? Do you ever turn on daytime television to see such pornography, such as Ellen DeGeneres dancing in a pantsuit? I mean, it's not even past the watershed. This filth should be on the same time slot as the sex box. Ugh! I just hate these freaks and kinksters walking down the street, having premarital hand-holding. Ugh, disgusting. These fucking degenerates. And even if you're a straight person who doesn't think gays kissing on television is literal smut, you would not believe how many people I've heard, so-proclaimed allies, that equate homosexuality and pedophilia within the same breath. And I don't even think they realize they're doing it half the time. I listened to two coworkers once mention that an old camp counselor came out as trans, and then began joking that they probably touched kids. Like, shit gets fucked up really quickly. So here's the thing. This whole notion that gay or trans people are all pedos, or more likely to be pedos, or even that gayness itself comes from being sexually abused, is a lot older than we think. There is a lot to unpack here, and I've rewritten this section quite a few times, so let's start with a top-down approach. As I've researched the history of homophobia and queerphobia, it quickly became apparent that these types of moral panic were not unique to queerness, and that these specific cultural ideas have historically been applied to a lot of different groups time and time again. So if I want to explain the moral panic over groomers, I kind of need to describe these tropes in the first place. This is not exhaustive, there's a lot I'm leaving out, and yes, I will be including further reading for this. It is its own very long essay. Trope 1. Blood libel. When I said we were starting at the beginning, I meant it. Blood libel is one of the earliest anti-Semitic canards, along with such favorites as host desecration and well poisoning, and is the accusation that Jewish people are ritualistically kidnapping Christian children, sacrificing them, and drinking their blood. Now you might be saying to yourself right now, wait, isn't murdering and eating babies one of those things people accuse witches and Satanists of doing? And the answer is yes. Luckily, nobody has used those tropes to accuse people of child abuse in the past. The main thing to take away from this trope is this general idea that a dangerous outsider group wants to harm the innocents in your society, namely your women and children. Trope 2. Degeneration. Now you might be noticing a pattern here. Pay attention. Degeneration theory comes from political ideas stemming from imperialism, genetics, and scientific racism of the mid-19th century. In essence, it's the idea that there are certain social groups that have negative qualities or traits that pollute the bloodline. It's an idea that's very much influenced by eugenics, so at the lowest end you have things like alcoholism and drug addiction being seen as degenerate, followed by more extreme ideas. Ableist eugenics, the idea that autistic or disabled people shouldn't reproduce, queerness as an abhorrent mutation, and it eventually delves into racial categories. It's important to understand that degeneration theory is political. It takes on the idea that these degenerates, these of low genetic stock, are going to cause the downfall of society, either through a type of genetic inbreeding leaving society weak, or through a natural fault in their person or culture causing society to become corrupt, hedonistic, or libertine. On its surface, when dealing with degeneration, fascists argue for things like anti-immigration, anti-miscegenation, and ghettoization. These policies we are all familiar with. When it comes to the social aspects, there's a more broader idea of degeneracy. The term used is cultural imperialism. It's this idea that a degenerate group is indoctrinating a populace with lies and propaganda through the lens of cultural osmosis. It's the jazz records, it's Coca-Cola, it's drag queen storytime, and PBS episodes of Sesame Street. They're changing your morals and your language and the status quo through insidious propaganda. Oh, also for the folks at home, this is also used as an anti-Semitic trope. Now I want to be very clear here. Am I saying that every single moral panic of the last 200 years is a result of direct and explicit fascist propaganda? Absolutely not. That would be absurd. However, I will say that the political ideas of eugenics and degeneration theory, which were popularized with fascism, were very influential to early 20th century politics, and that has trickled down into our collective unconsciousness. Sure, if you're at home, you might not believe that there needs to be a white ethno-state, but you might believe that there are certain groups of people that are politically and socially dangerous to you and to women and children. Oftentimes, that group tends to be racialized. Perhaps it's the Mexicans, or the blacks, or the Muslims, or the Jews. And other times, it's social groups. hippies, communists, the gays. And when you look at it that way, a lot of moral panics start to feel very similar. Maybe people aren't accusing redheads of poisoning the wells or sickening the wheat, but witch hunts still happen often because we're thinking of the children. Some more news relates this type of child crusading to counter movements against things like women's suffrage and desegregation. Kylan Conrad's video essay, What is a Groomer?, draws parallels between things like the Salem witch trials, the Satanic Panic, and the Nazi propaganda of the Hugen von Feuer and Hugen von Derber. Oh, I have a quote for this, by the way. The stereotype of the homosexual as effeminate and degenerate, depraved and corrupt, became the unifying view of the homosexual personality, and a focus for homophobic hostility. So too did another common stereotype, that of the seducer and corrupter of youth, Hugen von Feuer and Hugen von Derber, a uniquely dangerous figure who lured normal young men into depravity and thus spread the epidemic of homosexuality. In helping to marginalize the sexual within the movement's masculine fraternal order, homophobia played a key role in stabilizing the National Socialist regime. Well, that sounds familiar. I would also like to shout out other perennial favorites, such as the 1920s Coke Fiend, which you might know as the Super Predator. It was the cultural idea that black men, when they snort that white powder, became raving lunatics and raped all the white women. There's also more modern moral panics that attack our women and children, such as the predatory transgenderers, which is just a reskinned gay predator myth.
Public restrooms can often be a hangout for the homosexual. Bobby and his friends hadn't noticed the man who had been in the restroom when they changed.
And of course, QAnon, the alt-right conspiracy theory that Democrats such as Hillary Clinton are in fact part of a shadowy cabal that kidnaps children to ritualistically sacrifice and drink their blood. That sounds really familiar. Fuck. Where have I heard that before? Like I've been saying, the more you look into this, the more you start to see patterns. So on its surface, it's pretty easy to see how something like the queer groomer myth is one link in a chain of fear-mongering going back centuries. It should also be noticed that a lot of elements of this seem to get their roots in fascist propaganda. However, to leave it there would be a bit reductive. Ad Hitlerum, in fact. Because however much it resembles previous hate-mongering by objectively morally bad people, it doesn't actually refute it. So let's dig deeper. First, I shouldn't have to say this, but gay or trans people are no more likely to diddle your children than anyone else. Here's some statistics on screen. I'm not going to waste my time arguing about this any further. However, while the myth is not based in reality, it does have somewhat of a consistent origin, and that was an anti-gay propaganda of the 1970s. But before we get to the orange juice lady, here's a quick and dirty summary of the gays in early 20th century. The idea of homosexuality as a social construct of someone being gay is relatively modern. It's not until the late 60s and early 70s that we really see queer people become politically organized around this social construction. Before then, there was two popular viewpoints. One, you're a dirty sinner who gives into the corruption of sex and kink, a sodomite. Or two, there was like something medically wrong with you that gave you paraphilic urges to kiss another man on the lips. In early psychoanalysis, the main idea was of sexual inversion, essentially being psychologically intersex, a man with a feminine sex drive, a woman with a masculine gender expression, so on and so forth. The big question was whether inversion was innate, genetic, or acquired, conditioned. People like Hirschfeld and Krafft-Ebing thought it was biological, and people like Freud thought it was psychological. For Nuance and 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, Freud compares sexuality to being intersex, and notes that intersex persons imply an evolutionary state where we are all born bisexed, and then we as a species became dimorphic over time. He then infers that humans are all born bisexual, and through psychosocial development become dimorphically monosexual. In essence, Freud said that being both gay or straight was in fact a weird sex thing, because Freud thought everything was a weird sex thing. However, people took his idea of something turns you gay into we should try to stop people from being turned gay. And so while Freud was surprisingly okay with the gay, it did lead in some small way to the advent of gay conversion therapy, where people tried to correct the supposed gay conditioning. There's a lot of other things like the Eulenburg affair and the Lavender Scare and the Kinsey Report, but in essence, the main public opinion about gay people going into the mid-20th century is that they were either 1. Mentally insane, 2. Depraved heathens, 3. Simps for America's enemies, or D. Any of the above. Moving into the 60s, we see the beginning of the sexual revolution, where a lot of marginalized groups began to sexually liberate themselves, often in response to traditional dehumanization and desexualization. For gay men, that meant reinventing the tropes used to define themselves. Instead of the limp wrists of the Nances and Fairies, gay men began to adopt and fetishize working-class masculinity, often through the lens of such smut peddlers like Tom of Finland, Al Parker, and Joe Gage. The image of gay men was no longer an anemic dandy castrated by his sexual inversion. He was the Castro clone and the leather daddy, a hyper-masculine, fuckable sex machine, further deepening the society's opinion that gay men were in fact all freaks and kinksters. I do know that the opinion that gay men as sexual predator is older than the campaigns of Anita Bryant. For example, Boys Beware, which I've referenced, came out in 1961, but I can't pinpoint when this shift in tropes began. However, no matter who started it, the Orange Lady was going to finish it. So, who's Anita Bryant? Well, in the 70s, she was an ex-pageant queen turned singer who had reached some level of popularity as a pop singer. We're talking records, we're talking celebrity cameos. She sang at the halftime show. She was that nice lady who sang about fruit juice. It was a milkshake duck waiting to happen. In 1977, Dade County passed Ordinance 77-4, which included discrimination protection for the gays, and Anita Bryant had an announcement to make. If there was one thing she loved, it was good, fresh, and pure Floridian orange juice. And if it was one thing she hated, it was those dirty little homos. Anita Bryant quickly founded Save Our Children, Inc., which was quickly supported by the New Christian Right, who were itching to find something new to campaign against after their failures to oppose desegregation and abortion rights. It should be noted that along with her criticism of the ordinance, one of her main concerns were gay teachers who she believed would encourage her children into the gay lifestyle. It turns out that a multicultural and diverse city tends to be the type of place where people are okay with different ways of life. And after a poll in which 2/3 of women opposed repealing the ordinance, Bryant had to switch tactics. And what she decided to do was call the gays a bunch of perverts and degenerates. But don't take my word for it. Take hers. Homosexuals cannot reproduce, so they must recruit. And to freshen their ranks, they must recruit the youth of America. I shall continue to fight against that recruitment. The attempt by homosexuals to label this as a civil rights issue was nothing but camouflage. If we as a nation eventually come to the place where this is sanctioned as a legitimate civil rights issue, then what is to stop the adulterer from claiming adulterer's rights, the murderer from shouting murderer's rights, the thief to claim extortioner's rights, and a rebellious young person to insist on rebellious child's rights? In our campaign, we talk about the danger of the homosexual becoming a role model to our children. I'm not talking about child molestation in the physical, I'm talking about the psychological, which is even more detrimental, which has far-reaching effects on our children and our nation. Anita Bryant truly believed that having visible queerness, what she defined as the militant homosexual who flaunted his lifestyle, would lead to indoctrination and corruption of youth. Her attitudes, which mind you were not unique to her, were shared by the New Christian Right, and this propaganda spread to other states as the debate over Dade County took on culture war significance. She was the perfect figurehead, who starts more moral outrage than a beautiful, white woman, devoted to living a good Christian life, who has been put upon by these ravishers, these fiends, these blackhearts, these degenerates spreading their filth and disease. Why, she's Europa, she's Helen Lovejoy, she's Abigail Williams, she's Miss Bryant. She and the children must be protected. And you can probably tell from that description that she was a bit of a Karen. And so in a very interesting way, a lot of gay people credit her for being the gadfly that got the ball rolling, helping politicize gay people into a solid voting bloc, an immoral subculture against the moral majority. However, even though Anita Bryant eventually lost the culture war, the damage was already done. She had popularized the gay groomer myth, and we would see this specter continue to haunt us for many years to come. I think at this point, I've made it pretty clear that just like in Berlin and Miami, whenever queerness becomes more tolerant and accepted, there tends to be a backlash by extreme right-wing actors, who call for the abolishing of the degenerates. Visible queerness calls into question things like gender roles and the rigid rule set that it enforces. Queer people live outside heteronormativity, and therefore it makes all the smaller rules about gender that more fugitive. This is met with resentment by those in power, because that system of gender is one of the tools that enforces the status quo, and the injustice within. Queer people, in a certain way, are anarchists and abolitionists, and those that cling to their seats of power fear what queerness stands for. At this point, I believe you can understand why Alex Antics' accusations... That's a tongueful. At this point, I believe you can understand why Alex Antics' accusations are a cheap and tacky ad hominem attack. However, this argument doesn't address some of the very real questions and concerns that people have around drag and queer culture. So let's dig a little deeper.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
I think that we are safe to say that it was homophobic for Alex Antic to call Courtney Act a pedo for being pansexual or gender fluid or even polyamorous. Those aspects of her life have nothing to do with her actions. However, a lot of recent controversies is not that as Anderson Cooper or Ellen DeGeneres transing the children, but drag queens. In fact, there have been several high-profile attacks and protests on the drag community. Events like the Edison Brewery protest, the Club Q shooting, and yeah, this whole thing. It has been a consistent canard from political muckrakers that wearing a dress and a breastplate is tantamount to sissy hypnotism rays. So we should probably address it, right? So first, there's a lot of reasons why people who are male would wear feminine clothing. So let's break it down. 1. They're a femboy. They like the aesthetic of dressing in a feminine manner. 2. They're a sissy and it's a sex thing. 3. They're a drag queen who's doing a female impersonation act. It's important to recognize that only one of these types of cross-dressing is explicitly sexual, and it's not the one you're seeing in Hamburger Mary's. Unfortunately, a lot of people assume that all cross-dressing is a weird sex thing, and fun fact, it's not. Some people just like to dress up. For those that are skeptical, just imagine a woman wearing a suit. If you find this image of Cate Blanchett to be the height of kink, then I can't help you. Oh my fucking god. No. The other photo I had of Cate Blanchett in my phone. Okay, there we go. Moving on. Now you might be saying, Ryan, I don't think drag is a sex thing, but drag queens are serving fish. They're serving cunt. They are big mommy milkers. How is this not sexualized? And that is a fair point. So to understand the situation, we kind of have to understand drag. So what is it? Drag is essentially a performance art where people exaggerate gender presentation. There's the standard fish drag, where drag performers try to look like beautiful women, but there's also skag, where you combine hyper-masculine and hyper-feminine traits, and club kid drag, which attempts for this avant-garde and haute couture costuming. It's basically like Lady Gaga stuff. And there's anti-drag, which, while maybe is not a used term anymore, is meant to impersonate the dowdery ant sort. It's the type of stuff that people like Dame Edna and Medea are doing. It turns out that just how women are not always trying to be sexy to appeal to the male gaze, neither are female impersonators. Dressing up as a woman doesn't immediately mean they're trying to get you hard. So, I want to do something fun, since I have, for secret reasons, done a bunch of research into early queer cinema. Let's talk about the history of drag in film. The first drag film is most likely The Old Maid Having Her Picture Taken by E.S. Porter, which is what I would call spinster drag, where you have this man dressing up as a shriveled apple of an old woman, serving as babushka realness, hunty. And this kind of spinster character continues into the 1910s. We have Meet Me at the Fountain, A Busy Day, Miss Sweetie, Miss Fatty's Sweetside Lovers, and Bumping into Broadway. However, around 1914, we also begin to see more flattering drag performances by names like Charlie Chaplin, Mabel Normand, Gloria Swanson, Asta Nielsen, Buster Keaton. and female impersonators like Julian Eltinge and Bothwell Brown. Oh, I should probably mention that female impersonators were really popular. Julian Eltinge was an A-list celebrity. He was selling war bonds along with the likes of Mary Pickford. He was literally featured in one of the first celebrity cameos in Molly Malone Made Good. Prior to the 30s, drag was just a kind of entertainment, a gender minstrelsy, and it didn't really carry a queer stigma. In fact, it was pretty popular entertainment for the troops during the World Wars. It should be noted that the country was still highly homophobic at the time. Being gay was a crime, and while theatergoers might have lost their shit at an Eltinge rig reveal, there were still cops arresting cross-dressers, and sentencing war heroes like Alan Turing to chemical castration. By the way, he was the guy who solved the Enigma machine, one of the reasons why we won World War II. Point is that drag wasn't a weird sex thing for a generation of people who thought it was kinky to go down on your wife. And drag still existed after the Hays Code for generations. Sure, you had John Waters movies and Dr. Frankenfurter, but you also had performers like Dame Edna, Geraldine Jones, Wanda Wayne, and Shanae Jenkins. And going into the 90s, there was a lot of drag comedies. What the hell do you think Dear Wing Fu, Mrs. Doubtfire, Big Mama's House were, if not men doing a drag performance? Drag is a performance style that has existed for generations and has been done in a lot of ways by a lot of people. It should also be noticed that most of these drag performances I've mentioned were done by straight people for straight audiences. So why is drag just good fun when a straight man does it, but it suddenly becomes insidious when some guy from Ohio puts on a big wig? It's the whole gays are perverts thing again, isn't it?
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
There. In her video on autogynephilia, philosopher Natalie Wynn discusses the pet theory of a scientist named Ray Blanchard. His theory, and I am paraphrasing greatly, is that being trans is in fact a weird sex thing, a kind of ultimate transvesticism. Wynn argues against this claim, and at one point she draws comparisons between the supposed debauchery of trans women and the sex acts of cisgendered people. She discusses how under Blanchard's typography, actions such as wearing sexy clothing, touching one's body, and sending people nudes is viewed under the lens of extreme paraphilia. She ends her exploration on the topic with these lines.
But the point is, it seems like it's only when it comes to trans women that we feel the need to whip out the suffix philia. It seems what's going on here is a lot of pathologizing of normal female sexuality when it exists in trans women. But of course that raises the question, what is normal female sexuality?
This interchange has always stuck with me, and I think about it a lot when topics like kink at Pride get brought up. So I want to propose to you two biases within society. Bias 1. Society is less tolerant to queer people when they express normative sexual and romantic desires. Bias 2. Society is more tolerant to cishet people when they express paraphilic ones. So I think that it wouldn't be amiss to say that America has a weird sex thing with sex, right? Like, we balk at the idea of a woman being topless in a movie, but we're perfectly fine with her eating a sloppy cheeseburger in a bikini, getting that burger grease all over her tits. The fact is that a lot of adult human social interaction is at least in some small part sexual. When we see beautiful people sell us products on television, that's a sex thing. When we see Beyonce wear a unitard in a music video, that's a sex thing. When I decide to wear cologne and pop another button on my shirt, that's a sex thing. I'm dressing this way because it makes me feel sexy and virile. Because I'm a slutbag that wants your attention. There are a lot of instances of normal human society that engage with this kind of softcore, a bit of visual teasing and pinup. However, the second a visibly queer person wants to join the décolletage party, people start having hissy fits. Take, for instance, Lil Nas X. I mention him for two reasons. One, Essie, oh baby! And two, because his career actually shows this bias really well. Hip-hop has been accused of a lot of things, and one of those is the sexual objectification of women. It's a stereotype at this point that hip-hop videos got the shawties caked up on a Thursday afternoon twerking in the background. However, Lil Nas X is a queer man, and that means that his videos feature men in those objectified roles. This follows that there has been a lot of conservative backlash to pretty much everything he has ever done. I can listen to Dr. Dre fuck a bitch on his Chronic album, but as soon as a gay man wants someone to shoot a child in my mouth while I'm writing, we get comments like this. Hashtag Lil Nas X isn't fighting for gay rights. He's marketing the sexual irresponsibility that's causing young men to die from AIDS. Being gay is one thing, but being a super spreader is another. There's nothing healthy or helpful about that video, especially for children. Big yikes. I would read more of these comments out, but the internet and its infinite capriciousness has prevented me from seeing the juicy hate comments. So in the cards are some links to the phenomenon that's more bleak. Enjoy. Now you might be a Puritan who views all public sexiness as prurient and vulgar, and I respect your consistency. However, for the rest of us repressed slutbags out here, you might want to stop a second and notice the double standard. Women can walk around Coachella with nothing but some pasties on, and that's seen as good college fun, but a shirtless man wearing a leather harness at Folsom is seen as the height of deviance. The truth is that sex is sold to us in television, music, and other media constantly. People just don't recognize it because it's straight sex and it's meant to appeal to them. Now, if you're one of those prudes who type shit like sex scenes should never be in movies, you might say something like, I don't want to see any sexiness. Why can't we have good, pure romance without all this smut? You know, like MGM classic 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. And honestly, we should have parts of our society that cater to the non-sluts. However, queer romance is never seen as non-slutty. Queer sexuality is constantly seen as more deviant, and the media responds by tuning it down, but it's never enough. Take that Campbell's Soup ad we watched earlier. These bitches don't even touch each other, and Becky's on the timeline raving about butt sex. TV tropes and idioms refer to this phenomenon on their page, but not too gay. A prime example of this is Brokeback Mountain. Are you hearing that it was tantamount to a Bruce of Los Angeles cowboy fuckfest? And the entire film features one closed sex scene between them. The film also features several longer, straight sex scenes which are more explicitly eroticized. However, a 2-hour tragedy about closeting that revolves queer romance and trauma somehow has consistently been reduced down to that smutty cowboy movie. This also ties into the MPAA's known bias where they rank movies of queer romances a higher ranking than straight ones. Since you know, the queers can be upsetting to a family audience. I love that it's 2023, but we're using the same logic about queer representation that the MPA did when importing 1961's Victim. Point being, there cannot be a single queer romance out there without some chucklefuck saying shit like, why do the gays have to be in everything? I just don't want them shoving their lifestyle in my face. And that lifestyle can literally be as tame as the birdcage couple from Modern Family. It's pretty clear that no matter what gay people do, they will be seen as sexual deviants, even if that's just feeding their kids Campbell's Star Wars shaped noodle soup. Now, we have talked about how grooming is a multi-stage process that attempts to sexualize relationship between an adult and a child, and we have discussed how media can have subliminal sexual programming. So it may stand to reason that some media normalizes the sexualization of children. You're right. Let's talk about it. This is a call-out post. First up, child beauty pageants. Okay, groomer. I would like to know why you think it's appropriate for 12-year-olds to be modeling bikinis to a room of old men. Clearly, that's an event that would never attract a child molester. Also, while we're on the topic, why are we selling skin-tight leggings and crop tops to 14-year-old girls? I'm sorry, but that's a child. In fact, one study estimated that 1/3 of tween fashion for girls was considered sexualized. Oh, and it doesn't stop there, honey. Let's talk about school dress codes. Okay, you think it's too slutty for a teenage girl to have bare shoulders in the classroom? Oh, do those spaghetti straps do that for you? Pervert. But it keeps going. We start off this weird child sexualization early. Here's some fun baby onesies. Daddy's little squirt. I was the fastest swimmer. Hey baby, your crib or mine. Pick me up, sweetheart. I love older chicks. Does this diaper make my butt look big? Watch out, ladies. Watch out for what? Are you going to fuck this baby or something? I just love how the gays can't write a song or get Campbell's Soup money without being accused of butt-fucking and spreading AIDS. But Janet from Finance can dress her offspring in shirts talking about how she got cream pie 6 months ago, and that's seen as a normal social custom. You know what else is seen as a normal social custom? Old-ass men dating jailbait. There is literally a meme right now about how Leonardo DiCaprio has never dated a woman over the age of 25. Fun fact, he is 48. Another fun fact, that's about the age difference between me and my mother. gross. And you might say, Ryan, sure, it's a little bit icky for men to date young, barely legal girls, but it is still legal. Well, that is true. I'm sure that if a famous person like Harvey Weinstein or Roman Polanski were accused of sexual abuse, they wouldn't be allowed in polite society. Oh, what's that? They did commit those crimes, and people still talk to them? Odd bodkins, how bizarre. In fact, while on the topic of people supporting pedos, let's talk about Dan Schneider. 90s kids might remember him as the cook from Good Burger, and 2000s kids would remember him as the showrunner from such signature shows as iCarly. Fun fact, he has a foot fetish. Other fun fact, the reason why we know this is because he would constantly put foot stuff into his kids' shows and also his marketing. There's a rather infamous moment where he encouraged children to send pictures of their feet to the Sam and Cat Twitter page to promote an episode. That tweet was in 2013. It took till 2018 before he was fired. Let's be clear about something. Even if you think the sex joke baby onesies and toddler wedding photo shoots are just harmless fun, there is absolutely a culture of sexualizing minors that ranges from Bieber moms to all those weirdly sexual teen films from the 2000s. And if you're really out here trying to get rid of the pedos in our society, you would be trying to ban child beauty pageants and boycott people trying to make the next New York Minute. The literal child grooming that's happening, not the music show at the local brunch spot. You don't care about the children, you just hate the gays. Okay, let's talk about politicians now. It should be telling that the Stronger Capta bill, oh, that's the one that literally gave more money to preventing child abuse, took several years to pass. And after that, 78 Republicans voted no on the legislation. Here's a list. This is a call-out post. Now you might be saying, but Ryan, CAPTA does have a lot of issues. It has racial biases, and a lot of people criticize the fact that it's reactive rather than proactive. It needs to be reformed. And first, thank you for saying that. You're right, the system is not perfect. But also, most politicians are not so level-headed. And if you're a conservative Republican who as part of your platform wants to save our kids, and you're leaving a feel-good public works bill like that on the table, then what are you doing to save our kids? Like, I'm not seeing a lot of other legislative action around here. Oh wait, my apologies, we have an update. Apparently Florida Governor DeSantis has made an anti-grooming bill. Let's take a look at it. Oh, it's the Don't Say Gay bill. The one that's vaguely worded and acts as a political attack against LGBT teachers spreading their woke ideology. You know, the type of political rhetoric used by the Johns Committee and Anita Bryant. Love to see history repeat itself. Well, at least if our child crusaders aren't actively doing their jobs and fulfilling their campaign promises, hopefully they are at least doing the social work of weeding out and disavowing the child predators within their own ranks. Oh wait, I'm getting a rather large update on the topic. Let's read the news. Oh, wow! Lauren Baba's husband whipped his dick out at a bowling alley in 2004. Oh, I'm sorry. According to her, the bartender, who was 17 at the time, encouraged him to show her his secret tattoo, that tattoo being on his penis. He was arrested and charged with public indecency. With that on her record, well, one of the things on her record, you'd think she would vote yes on a bill like this. She and her child crusader friend Marjorie Taylor Greene voted in negation. Where we're on the topic of voting, let's talk about a Tennessee bill that would allow common law marriage without an age limit, which some proponents discuss how that can lead to child marriage. It's either incredibly sloppy legislative writing, or an effect the writers of the bill were perfectly comfortable with. Perhaps Tennessee Representative John Rose would have an interesting perspective on this, since he met his future wife when she was 17. This more, but I'm just going to run some local news footage.
Children, all of those horrible slurs and smears that have made a comeback, all part of the Republicans' pretend crusade against grooming and against child sex abuse. But you know what they say, every accusation is an admission. Take Patricia Kent, a Utah woman who founded a right-wing political group that has attacked drag shows and who herself has claimed that drag queens were, quote, grooming our children for immoral satanic worship. Turns out she's the same woman who had her teaching certificate revoked 25 years ago by the Utah State Board of Education for unprofessional conduct, including inappropriate relationships with students that were, quote, too familiar. Kent has denied those allegations. And then, of course, there's conservative firebrand Jim Jordan. The GOP can't seem to attend a hearing without putting him front and center. Before he was a congressman, Jim Jordan used to do all of his yelling as former assistant wrestling coach at the Ohio State University, where 8 former student wrestlers have accused him of ignoring sexual abuse allegations about a team doctor back in the 1990s. Jordan denies any wrongdoing. There's also Roy Moore. How can we forget him? The 2017 Republican candidate for a U.S. Senate seat in Alabama, endorsed by Trump and by the RNC, who was accused of sexual misconduct or impropriety by 8 women that occurred when some of them were still girls as young as 14 and 16. Roy Moore denied any wrongdoing. Some Republicans have even been arrested. Republican strategist and donor Tony Lazzaro was arrested last summer for underage sex trafficking. He's pleaded not guilty. 2 GOP candidates who ran in the midterm elections only weeks ago were arrested on sex crime charges. One is South Dakota State Senate candidate Joel Koskan, who is facing felony child abuse charges involving a family member. Koskan denies having intercourse with the victim. And the other is Arizona College Board candidate Randy Kaufman. He's been charged with public sexual indecency for an alleged act outside of a preschool. And let's not forget the ones who served time in prison, including the former Republican Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert, who spent 13 months in prison after admitting to sexually abusing young boys. The judge called him a serial child molester. The former GOP House Speaker. How can we never hear his name? And earlier this year, an ex-GOP staffer who helped design social media ads for Donald Trump's re-election campaign was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison for trading in child pornography. So
Moore and Jordan are also elected representatives and also voted in negation. Wow, the Save Our Children people, you're doing a really good job of ignoring child endangerment. Now that I've had my fun and pointed the finger and been like, actually, my political enemies are the real groomers, let's actually take a step back and ask why. Yeah, this video isn't getting monetized, people. Sorry. I was in high school during the 2010s, which meant that people my age were talking a lot about the hashtag #MeToo movement and rape culture, which for those that aren't hip and with it, is society's apathy or ignorance that helps condone and support rape. One of the things that the Me Too and other feminist movements around this time did was lead the discussion of things like what is sexual assault and sexual harassment, and better understanding consent. It was in part a cultural movement that tried to dispel misconceptions around rape. And it had a profound impact on politics. Some states began using an enthusiastic consent model. Yes means yes, rather than the more limited no means no stance, which doesn't help for situations in which someone can't verbally communicate, such as with the case of Brock Turner, whose victim was blackout drunk at the time. However, there was plenty of pushback, often because sexual assault is shameful, and a lot of people would rather ignore there's a problem than admit that they have either been a victim or a perpetrator. And I can completely understand why someone wouldn't want to admit that to themselves. It's very difficult, but ignoring these acts of abuse and the systems that perpetrate it helps no one. It makes me think about the child abuse cases that have plagued religious institutes like the Latter-day Saints and the Catholic Church, and the hundreds of young girls abused by Larry Nassar. These situations were all exasperated by people choosing to ignore their misgivings and ignoring what children were literally telling them. This willful ignorance of ignoring these difficult realities is in fact what perpetrates this culture of child abuse. Here's another line from Courtney Act. I know, I forgot this was part of it too for a second. When kids can't have open, honest conversations with caregivers and teachers, when they don't learn about themselves and the toys they play with, the books they read, and the TV they watch, they go looking for answers elsewhere and for people who will listen. Kids looking to be heard can often find people willing to listen in chat rooms and inappropriate corners of the internet. To ensure the safety of children, we need to create environments where they feel affirmed, free to ask questions, and talk about their feelings. Lack of diverse examples means we develop with an inability to understand, to be empathetic, and accepting of experiences different to our own. As the old saying goes, if you don't teach your children, someone else will. Child advocates talk about how we need to have earlier sex education, and that means things like teaching your child about their body and about consent, things that allow them to communicate and recognize when they are being taken advantage of. Grooming is a serious problem, but it's also something that we have to be honest with ourselves with and face the difficult internal and emotional battles that combating it requires, not just blaming a bunch of people that you think have the metaphorical devil in them.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Hopefully, for anyone watching, I have managed to give you some perspective on this whole groomer narrative. I have done my best to provide as much additional reading and references as possible, and I would apologize for making this video this long, but it turned out the topic was deeper than I expected. Stay safe, fight propaganda, and listen to your goddamn children. Okay, good night. It's Falsebooles123, and as always, I'm signing out. Or having Pinterest. Because I have to name everything the most obnoxious titles. Hi, my name's Falsebooles123 and I'm an asshole. It's the jazz records. So loud, okay. Oh, I should probably mention that female impersonators were really popular. Julian Eltinge was an A-list celebrity. He was selling war blondes. Get by your war blondes today. Big yikes! I would read more of these comments, but you're right. Let's talk about it. This is a call-out post. This is a call-out post. Hello, I would like to call out everyone who has done the problematics. Okay.
And every...
Security agent. Security agent. No, let him stay.
No.
Let him stay.
Well, at least it's a fruit pie.